Okay, so today's session is all about commercial versus residential property in the context of HMRC reporting and of course with regards to the pensions legislation. We're going to talk about various details in terms of what you can and can't do, but we're also going to introduce and talk about genuinely diverse commercial vehicles, GDCVs, and of course REITs. Now, commercial and residential property, the issues have been bounced around for many years within the SaaS industry, and you would have thought it's quite simple. You've got a shop with a flat above it, the shop is commercial, we can buy that, the flat is residential, we can't buy that, so you do a title split and away you go. The SaaS buys the shop, someone else buys the flat. Not quite as simple, because the flat may well be commercial. If the flat is provided to the manager of the shop, not rented to them, this is really important, provided to them, they don't pay rent, part of their P11D benefits, part of their PAYE structure, so they get a small salary and a flat, they don't pay rent, it's not rented. That makes the flat commercial, makes the shop commercial, makes the flat commercial. You can buy both. Conversely, if you have to walk through the shop to get into a flat that's being rented, then sadly the shop is residential because it's effectively a downstairs part of a residential flat. So again, you need to know your stuff, and anyone who doesn't ask you questions about the people who are upstairs and doesn't ask you questions about the access is demonstrating their lack of knowledge in this area. So the advice tends to be run for the hills. What about a hotel? Yes, that's commercial, C1, it's a hotel, you can buy those in a SaaS, but you can't buy part of a hotel in a SaaS. By that I mean you can't buy the top floor, because the revenue will define that as residential. If you bought 12% of a hotel, because that's all you can afford, then that's absolutely fine, you're buying a percentage of the whole. But if you're physically buying the second floor or physically buying the top floor, sadly that's not allowed within the SaaS, because that is not deemed to be a commercial operation. Bit of a warning here, a little bit of knowledge is dangerous. At the end of this session you'll have a little bit of knowledge, so you might think you know all the answers. I certainly don't. It's always good to get advice or to talk things through with someone who knows what they're talking about, particularly when it comes to the dangers of accidentally ending up with something that's not allowed in a SaaS, because that's a very expensive mistake, and it is a bit like a minefield. And in this whole area I'm trying to explain that there are mines dotted around, and you have the opportunity to stand on them unknowingly, and the revenue will come along and they'll make a huge unauthorized payment surcharge fine on you. 55% is a bit of an ouch. So you've got options. You can work your way through the minefield, or you can get in a tank and drive across it oblivious to the rules because you're using an exemption. Anyway, let's move on and see where we go. The stuff we're interested in is contained within Schedule 29A of the Finance Act. This is basically the SaaS pensions legislation, and it's important that you understand some of the small, simple, logical bits as opposed to memorizing the entire thing, like some people have. First of all, residential property is not allowed except in the situations where it is allowed, which sounds a bit counterintuitive, but hopefully you'll understand by the time we get to the end of this session. Residential property, definitely a no-no unless it falls into clearly defined, very clearly explained exemptions. So here's an example. Imagine that you were going to buy units in a property unit trust, and you made a choice to go with Legal and General. I'm not giving investment advice, so this is just a graphic for the sake of it. And you went and bought those units in a unit trust. Nobody's going to ask Legal and General if they've got any residential property inside their unit trust. So as far as your pension is concerned, it has made an allowable purchase in a bona fide structure, a unit trust, which passes the test of being a GDCV, a genuinely diverse commercial vehicle. Now, I've mentioned unit trust and I've mentioned GDCV. What I need you to understand is that a GDCV is not actually a thing. It's not like a trust or a company. It's a set of rules. And if you look at the set of rules within a genuinely diverse commercial vehicle, you can in fact position yourself so that you don't have to worry about is something commercial, is something residential, because a GDCV or something that passes that test is absolutely 100% categorically allowed residential property within it. There's another exempt structure, which is a REIT, a real estate investment trust, and the real estate investment trust is also allowed to contain residential property. And the subtle differences between the two tend to be that a REIT has to hold property for a minimum of 3 years, otherwise it pays corporation tax internally, whereas a GDCV is allowed to buy and manage and flip and trade. So those are the two main exemptions. There are others, like if you buy a children's home, but it's important you realise that when it comes to the inland revenue, it's about the entire interaction between your SSAS and the thing. So if you buy a house and you're going to convert it into a children's home, during the process of conversion, it's a house. So at the very point that you touch it, your SSAS has committed the cardinal sin of having residential property. However, if there's an existing children's home all licensed up and ready to rock and roll, and it's got children in it, there's nothing stopping you coming along and buying that or part of that. So really important you understand when it comes to the pensions legislation, the offence of residential property starts from the minute you interact and ends when the interaction is finished. All the fiddling around in the middle is almost irrelevant because you've already committed what I call the offence in inverted commas. Anyway, hope that's helpful. That's a little introduction to the REITs and the GDCVs. Let's look in more detail at them in turn. Okay, so let's have a look at a REIT and a SSAS. Your SSAS starts off with cash and it is spending the cash, and in exchange it's going to get shares in the REIT. Now from a reporting standpoint, at the moment we're asked what the bank balance was at the beginning and what the bank balance was at the end, and we're asked what has been purchased. But those of us who are involved in SSAS administration will know that the new reporting system, the managing pension scheme system, doesn't actually ask any questions at the moment, because the reporting system, the new one, hasn't been finished and finalised and launched yet. So there's a lot of work being done in the background, because if you think about it, if I reported that I'd bought shares in a company, how are the revenue to know if it's a REIT without them actually asking for the company registration number? How are they going to know that you haven't just bought shares in a company that's got a buy-to-let in it, which is sadly one of the big no-nos inside a SSAS. So yeah, there's a lot of work being done redesigning the HMRC reporting system, and I'm not sure exactly when that's coming out, but we know that it has to soon, because for the last couple of years SSAS's new ones haven't been able to do an annual return. So anyway, sorry, back to the REIT. You can have preference shares or ordinary shares, and the reason why you do that is because the REIT legislation says that your pension scheme cannot benefit from the income from just one property. So if you're buying preference shares, you're not actually benefiting from the income from any property. You're benefiting by a fixed rate of return on those preference shares. So it doesn't matter whether you've got one property or 10 properties, the preference shares will determine the return that comes back into the SSAS. A REIT can issue the ordinary shares to, for example, a structure like a QNUPS, and the QNUPS will contain the ordinary shares, and the bulk of the property profit will end up going into the QNUPS. Now this is something which is lifetime limit planning territory, which may or may not be applicable anymore because the lifetime limit in the recent budget was removed, but there's a little bit of political manoeuvring with the Labour Party thinking they're going to reintroduce it. So it may well be in the future that we come back to this whole area of lifetime limit planning, and for those who've done it, then they've hedged their bets in terms of politicalness. But again, something like a REIT is for sophisticated investment only. Clients who are wanting to buy one buy-to-let would probably not benefit from a REIT, because the cost of running it would eat into the rent and it would just make it a ridiculous thing. So everything is down to what's happening, what are you doing, how are you doing it, what sort of money is involved, and is it financially in your interests to set up some complex structure. No point having a sledgehammer to crack a nut in terms of the financialness of your planning inside a pension. It's all well and good being tax effective, but if you're making a loss because of professional costs and charges, it's a completely meaningless exercise. This also goes back to when people ask me questions. They ask me loads and loads of questions about a REIT and how it works and the infrastructure and the costings of it, and then they say, I want to buy one buy to let. And I say, well, I've just spent 2 days explaining how a REIT works to you. Why didn't we start with what are you wanting to do, and then I'll determine what you need to know. And that's really the crux of giving proper tax advice. Rather than telling you about 200 different things that you could do, it's a lot better to start with your scenario and tell you about the 2 or 3 things that would be applicable for you to do. So caution, don't just jump over things because they sound good. Actually find out whether they're what you need. Now then, genuinely diverse commercial vehicles. What are the rules? The first obvious rule is you can't actually reside in the property held by the thing that's trying to get the badge called a GDCV. That goes without saying. You can't rent it out to your brother. You can't move in and sleep there for the next 12 years. You literally have to have this as an investment, not as a home. You can't own or control 10% or more of the share capital. You can't own or control more than 10% of the voting rights, and you can't receive 10% or more of the total income generated. So in this situation, if you've got your own property company, it's hardly likely that that's going to qualify as being a genuinely diverse commercial vehicle. But again, we'll come back to this later. You've got to have total assets of 1 million. Now bear in mind, this doesn't mean that your SSAS has got to have £1 million in it. It just means that the structure itself across all of the SSASs that it's involved in has to have £1 million, not just your one. And of course, the 3 residential properties have to be inside the structure. And no one asset can account for more than 40% of the total income. So if you're able to have a structure of some kind that passes all of these different rules, then it can wear the badge called genuinely diverse commercial vehicle, and whatever the structure is, your SSAS can get involved. So let's have a look. Legal and general. If you buy some units in a unit trust and it's a property unit trust, it's bound to have more than 3 residential properties. It's bound to have more than a value of £1 million. You're not buying any of the shares in legal and general. You're buying units in a unit trust, so you don't have any voting rights. You don't have any control over legal and general as a company. So in that sense, you going along and buying a legal and general unit trust which is invested in property, even if that property is residential, it passes the rules, therefore it is exempt. And that's an important thing. If you do pass the GDCV rules, then as far as HMRC is concerned, everything that happens inside that structure is to do with the structure and nothing to do with your SSAS. So it's about jumping into something that's a GDCV, using it as a tank and crossing the minefield and not worrying, is the shop commercial, is the flat residential, not worrying about when you're converting something, about at what point it becomes residential, because there's an enormous debate in the industry about when you have to exit. If you buy a commercial property and you're converting it into flats, when do you exit? Do you exit when the bathrooms are in? Do you exit when the kitchens are in? Or do you exit when the local council issues a habitation certificate? With a GDCV, you literally couldn't care less. It's also important to realise that you don't have to sell or refinance or spend huge amounts of money moving things around and taking it out of a tax-free environment. You can do all these conversions and keep them in a tax-free environment inside a GDCV, which is inside your pension. It's a bit like having a get-out-of-jail-free card and just walking around feeling a bit smug that you've got a property business that's tax exempt. So there you go. That's a brief introduction to the GDCV rules. Okay, so let's have a look. If you are getting involved with your own unit trust GDCV, you're not passing your money over to legal and general for them to manage it for you. First of all, if you're buying units in a particular thing like a unit trust, someone else will be and someone else will be, so you're not on your own in terms of SSASs buying units. So in terms of passing the tests, you have to actually look at the structure and the entirety of the thing, not just what you are doing. So let's have a look at the rules and see what the situation is. First of all, the units that you buy. It's important that you realise those are growth units, and by that we mean they increase in value every time that they have a valuation. So the rent that's coming in and the property value are accumulated together to come up with a new value. If your pension scheme needs cash, you sell some units in order to get cash. It's not like the units spit out an income. So in terms of the rules that talk about percentages of income, you're not getting any. You're getting growth. That's a really important distinction. And why do we make the distinction that you're buying growth units? Well, it's to underline the fact that you're not physically buying any part of the GDCV structure. So if it was a unit trust set up by a unit trust company, you are not buying shares in that unit trust company. You are not getting any voting rights or control in that unit trust company. So you cannot fail the tests because you're literally not buying shares in that organisation. Let's go through the rules that we showed earlier one at a time and see whether you pass the test. Obviously, it goes without saying you can't actually reside in the property, and neither can your brother or anyone who's connected. This is for investment purposes, not for developing tax-free homes. You can't own or control 10% or more of the share capital. Well, as I've said, you don't own any of the shares in the unit trust company that physically established the thing. So yeah, you don't. So that passes the test. You don't have any voting rights or control inside the trust company that established the unit trust. So again, in the same way as you don't have any percentage control or shares in Legal and General, you still don't have any of the shares or voting rights in the organisation that set the thing up. So that passes the test. And in terms of income, although there are plenty of other unit holders and whatever you do wouldn't generate 10% or more of the income generated, to be absolutely certain your units are capital in nature, so you receive no income at all. You have to sell units to generate money, so therefore you pass that. Total value of assets is already way in excess of $1 million, so even if you put 200,000 in, your 200,000 added to everyone else's money is into the multiple millions, so no issues there either. And again, same thing with residential properties, there's plenty in there already. And none of the assets individually account for more than 40% of the total income. Even the expensive high rental ones don't come near because there's a lot of properties. So the question is, does your small individual GDCV unit trust pass the test? The answer is yes, it does. And so that means that your SSAS can buy units and do exactly what it wants. It doesn't have to mind its P's and Q's when it comes to residential versus commercial. And in terms of reporting, all of the accounting and all of the reporting happenings inside the GDCV, all your SSAS has is a unit holding that goes up in value each year. So there's less opportunity for HMRC to be able to pull on a thread and unravel your property investment portfolio. So let's have a look at this HMRC reporting thing. This is actually a really important part of the entire session. You're not allowed to own residential property directly. That's the #1 golden rule. However, as I said earlier, some residential property isn't really residential in the same sense as a family can live in it. It might be a children's home. So again, residential property comes in a couple of different guises, and if you're just doing buy-to-lets or HMOs, even serviced accommodation, all of those things might happen inside a property that at the local council level is a straightforward residential property, and you can't own that directly. You also can't indirectly own a property, so you can't buy and own the shares in a company if the company itself is a bag that contains a residential property. So you can't say, oh, I own shares, I don't own property. That's what we call an indirect ownership. So you can't do that either. #2. #3 is an interest in something, and an interest in is very different to owning it directly. And this is actually a very, very important point, because the very minute you have any contractual interactions with something, be that a loan, you are indirectly involved. Doesn't matter at all, you have an indirect involvement. And the interest in something is triggered by paperwork interaction. So for example, I can't provide a loan so that someone can buy residential property. That's a direct interest, because I'm receiving an interest in money terms back to my SSAS, and that is directly connected with a residential property. And the final one is an interest in something indirectly. So perhaps if I lent money to a company and then that company had a subsidiary company, and that subsidiary company was stuffed full of residential property. Well, that's an indirect, because you have to go through a couple of companies to get to the property, but I've still got an interest in the whole thing because I've loaned money. I have a financial contract, financial interest. The loan agreement itself provides that interest. So the revenue will apply the usual tax avoidance rules. They will look at all the steps and they'll say, well, hang on, there's 12 steps here. So there's the SSAS, there's a company, there's another company and another company. They'll look through all of those and they'll end up saying, oh, well, residential property. So it's important that you get your head round 1, 2, 3 and 4 so that in your own world, in your own business, in your own activities within the SSAS, you can spend 2 or 3 minutes pondering and saying, does what I'm about to do fail number 1, number 2, number 3 or number 4? And if it does, you shouldn't do it. You should always check and make sure or get tax advice. And the important thing is you don't have to worry about any of those if you use a GDCV or a REIT. The next big thing is reporting and what causes HMRC to trigger an inquiry. I know they can randomly pick things and say we're doing an inquiry into your SSAS, but normally it's triggered because you've answered certain questions and they've asked them. And again, as I've said before, the new reporting system for the managing pension schemes physically hasn't been launched yet. So in terms of the questions that are asked, in order to trigger an inquiry, those are all being designed and developed. And it may well be that HMRC are taking input from pensions experts and input from technicians across the industry in order to actually establish the questions that they're asking. Because as we said earlier, if I'm investing in a property company or granting a loan to a property company, it might be completely allowable because they are a property management company that physically doesn't own any property. So we need to ask the question, not just have you made a loan, but to whom have you lent it the money to? What's the company number? Also, have you got security? And what is it that gives those shares the value? If it's residential property, then sadly it falls over. So HMRC reporting and the new system is going to be massively different to the old world, and my estimate is that there'll be an awful lot of more detailed questions which will give HMRC the chance to open up inquiries into the things that have happened. Anyone who's in SSAS administration knows hand on heart that something's happening purely because the new system doesn't physically function at the moment, so it must be being built. And any of these systems that are being built to ask what I would define as the absolute correct questions in order for HMRC to correctly ask for an inquiry to be opened, or for HMRC to correctly issue unauthorised payment surcharges. They have to have the questions in order to trigger the tax charge and or the investigation. So the whole world of SSAS and property and loan backs is changing. How it's going to change, everyone will soon find out, myself included. So hopefully that's an introduction to the rules 1, 2, 3 and 4 and a little bit of logic that you must apply in your thinking. Alternatively, use an exempt structure like a GDCV or a REIT. Okay, so let's go back to some of the things that people may or may not be doing out there in the big SSAS world. And before I go into them, it's important for me to say that if you have been involved or are thinking of getting involved in any of the things we're just about to talk about, I am not wishing to denigrate or in any way belittle any organisation who is doing these things. It's a personal choice for them and their clients and for you. What I'm trying to do here is to explain how it would be perceived by HMRC when or if they ask the right questions in order to come and sit down and have a chat. Okay, so let's have a little look. Loans secured on residential property. You can see the link there. It's absolutely glaring. So anything which is a loan and the security is residential property, then that's a big no-no, unless of course the residential property happens to be an exempt property such as a children's care home. Loans secured on shares in a property company, well, that fails as well, because the shares have a value. And what is it that drives the value of the property? Sorry, the value of the shares. It could be residential property. On the flip side, it might also be that this is a property company that does property management and maintenance for all of the local councils in the area, and therefore it does have a value. And the security offered is not boosted up by property, it's actually a trading value. So in this one, you need to ask further questions. What about a loan that's got a security trustee or an insolvency trustee? And in this particular bit of thinking, the property never goes into the SSAS, because in the event of a default, the property is sold and it is cash that goes into the SSAS. So let's see in our golden rules number 1, 2, 3 or 4. If you're lending something to a structure, it doesn't matter how many structures there are inside that thing, we're into the indirect situation. And at the very minute that you sign the paperwork and money leaves the SSAS, you have an indirect interest in residential property. So it fails on number 4 immediately, and the security or insolvency trustee bit only deals with what happens in the event of default. And it seems strange to think that that would work, because the legislation is really quite clear. The number 1, 2, 3 and 4 in terms of indirect interest in applies from the very moment the first document is signed all the way through to the very moment the whole thing is wound up. And it doesn't just say you can't physically put residential property into a SSAS. So the indirect connection with the residential property and the interest in the residential property, which is effectively number 4, the indirect interest in, absolutely this sort of planning fails immediately. But HMRC are not asking enough questions in order to actually dig this out. And if we look back historically, there may well be people who've done all sorts of different things, and they have, in inverted commas, been accepted by HMRC on the grounds that HMRC physically are not asking the right questions. And that's one of the reasons why the entire system is being updated with new questions to allow HMRC to sit down and say, oh, okay, so we've got another 800 of those to deal with in terms of sending out unauthorised payments, surcharges, or to open inquiries. It's going to be a big change, and quite rightly so, because there have been different arrangements that have got away with it, in inverted commas, for many, many years, purely because if you don't ask the questions, you don't get the information to allow you to come down and apply the taxes. So it's up to you to look at whatever it is that you're doing and make a decision. Does it pass or fail what we called those 1, 2, 3 and 4 basic principles? And if it fails, you should be concerned enough to suggest that an alternative approach is put in place. But anyway, I'm not giving you advice here, I'm just telling you the sorts of things that you should be thinking based on the sorts of things that HMRC will be thinking when they start to ask questions when the new system is launched. I'm saying allegedly they will ask these questions, because I don't know all of the questions that are going to be asked. But as a professional in this industry, I'd hazard a guess they're going to ask an awful lot more questions than they ever used to. Another quick point is that pensions cannot trade, and this is quite a contentious one, because what do we mean by trade, and can my SSAS do it? So go back to basic principles. You go to your accountant and you say to them, I'm going to buy commercial property and I'm going to keep it and rent it out ad infinitum. What tax would I be suffering if I were to sell the property at some point in the future? Well, that would be a capital gains tax situation. You're investing for the long term. Your intent is that it's a long-term investment. However, if you said to your accountant, I'm buying a commercial property, I've already explored planning permissions and I can convert this under permitted development into flats, and then I'm going to sell them. Well, that would be income tax, because you are actually trading. You're trading in the conversion of property from commercial to residential. And that is your intent at the point of purchase. And there'll be emails and there'll be inquiries, and you would have spoken with people. There'll be plenty of an audit trail in the whole situation for the revenue to know what tax applies. And that means there's an issue with pensions buying commercial properties with the intent of converting them, because that's a trade, and a pension cannot trade. And people say, oh yes, but what if I change my mind immediately after purchase? Well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to go through all of your emails and questions with professionals to work out that actually you were wanting to buy and convert, and your intent at the point of purchase was not to keep it long term. There's no evidence. What you haven't got is a 25-year full self-repairing lease offered to a tenant. It's a pretty good clue that you're actually wanting to do something with the property rather than renting it out long term. So pensions can't trade. You need to be aware of that, because the revenue can start to charge corporation tax. And they can charge it to your pension scheme because it is trading. And again, they haven't asked the right questions in the past, but they may well start to do so. However, if you have a unit trust, and the unit trust is a GDCV, that can trade. So you can buy property, you can develop property, you can flip the property, and you can do all of that inside a structure that is tax exempt, because a unit trust doesn't pay tax itself, it doesn't pay corporate taxes. All of the taxes are applied upon the holder of the units. And if the holder of the units is a pension scheme is exempt, therefore it doesn't receive any tax liability on that trade. Now, if you look at a pension naked without a GDCV, every property developer in the world, well, every property developer in the UK, for example, would do their trading inside a pension scheme if that were allowable. So because there are plenty of property developers who buy stuff and convert it and sell it outside of pensions, it's a good indication that your desire to buy that commercial property and to convert it and then to sell it for a gain is a trade and will not be allowed inside your pension scheme. Excuse me. So there we go. A little bit about pensions and trading. Again, simple logic, and it's stuff that you need to have under your belt in terms of your thought processes, because HMRC will do the same. Okay, so let's move on to a completely different subject now. It's the SSAS Property Tax Planning Chatbot that I've written. What I have done is look at the logic flowchart of questions that may well be asked in terms of what it is you're doing. Are you buying a residential property? Are you buying a commercial property? Are you buying a mixed use property? Are you buying land? What is it that you want to do? Who are you buying it from? Do you need to borrow money? All of these things have a pensions implication. So my little chatbot was put together based on my knowledge and experience and conversations with various people, including the revenue. And I wanted to see how it compared with this ChatGPT thing. And I asked ChatGPT 10 relatively simple SSAS property questions, and it started off by saying that it's not authorised to give tax advice, which is great, I agree with that, but it got all the questions wrong, which was really interesting. And if you look at it from a logic standpoint, ChatGPT is getting its information from the internet. It's getting it from all the different groups and comments and web pages where people are saying, oh yes, you can definitely do this, when actually you can't. So I wouldn't necessarily trust what's out there on the internet, because it's your SSAS. You need to take ownership and responsibility. It's a self-administered pension scheme, and I'm hoping that this session will give you some logic to look at the does it fail on the 1, 2, 3 or 4 aspect. And to help you with that, the SSAS Property Chatbot that you can go and get will ask you what it is you're trying to do, who you're buying from, etc., etc., and it will write a report. And like I say, there's 168 different property scenarios in there, and a report will cover off things like VAT, things like stamp duty, things like conveyancing, valuations, all the different pointers that you may need in a particular scenario. It's not there to give you advice, it's there to be almost an agenda of stuff to think about and discuss and move on and to work around. It may mention GDCVs, it may mention REITs, it may explain why one or either of them is not the right thing to do, but it's a useful resource and a useful tool, far more useful than Facebook groups. Because people can argue in a Facebook group and confuse the reader. If I was new to the industry and I read a fair number of the arguments on Facebook, I'd be totally confused as to what is the right thing to do. So if you're going to get advice, get it from an actual expert who knows what they're talking about, but more importantly, become a bit of an expert in how HMRC might think about whatever it is you're planning on doing. So the chatbot is there, you can go online, you can have a look at it. And if you want any of the training videos, you want my contact details, if you go to the link in the QR code, which is paul.mysmartbusinesscard.co.uk, all of the training videos are in there. So what is a SaaS? What about lending and borrowing? All the different things that you'd need to know. There's a complete SaaS masterclass there. I talk about property stuff as well, all completely free of charge, unlimited access to those. And I hope that that's been of some use to you all.